next 10 years. So, and I want to start by sharing frustration on the at least the outcomes that we're having in our hand now. But let me put you first on what happened in the process from the first beginning till this moment. يعني in quickly كده. طبعا as we know that the fourth international conference of financing and development will take place in Sevilla next week from the 30th of June to the 3rd of July. And it was supposed to shape the global financial rules and resources flows for the next 10 years, as I mentioned. At first, there was a zero draft released in January, and that was actually lacked concern targeted for climate finance and debt reform and gender inclusion. And the first draft in March made some improvements on aid volume, taxonomy of official development assistance, ODA يعني, and gender language safeguards, but also fell short on binding targets of global tax justice. We have to know that what the world was demanding, I mean, the global south was demanding in terms of the climate finance debate. The global south wanted to have a new additional public finance, insist that climate funding must come alongside not substitute, but alongside existing ODA. Grant-based debt-free funding. طبعا stress on consensual grants over loans or debt instruments to avoid increasing debt burdens. Adopting focus for Africa and vulnerable groups. Push for decades to resources, decade resources for adaptation and coastal protection, COPS water, etc. Green financial architecture reform. Advocate to have a UN-led review reforming development banks, climate mandates, and bringing transparency. And definitely we cannot speak about climate finance without speaking about tax and debt justice linkage. So the Global South was demanding a global tax cooperation plus debt restructuring tied to climate. We're already going to mention this. Diana will mention the efforts, how the efforts was around creating a debt, a UN debt framework or a debt mechanism. And last but not least, the gender responsive climate finance to boost gender budgeting and women-led adaptation projects. What happened is that the document that came yesterday, the day before yesterday, on the 17th, was very frustrating. We can say that there were some endorsement of climate finance from public resources and historical responsibility. Yeah, but and there were some reframed gender responsive taxation in, I mean, like in language which support feminist demand. And طبعا and thanks for our the African group and our colleagues. They're already the UN-led multilateral tax cooperation. So commitments secured the enabling solidarity financing mechanism. But the climate language watered down late in the process and weakening direct reference and urgency. And I mean, like, I wonder how the global north cannot see the urgency on the process. طبعا debt and tax justice initiatives diluted, no firm deadlines or bringing UN treaty, only vague intergovernmental process. And as the US, as my colleague already mentioned, the outcomes that was adopted on the 17th, the US walked away out, and they refused to endorse the outcomes and announced they will not participate in civilian. But that move is now being used to shield other like EU, UK, Canada, Japan, and other who played an equal role in gutting ambition and in the stalling progress and stripping the process from credibility. Um, while I mean, the final document was adopted by consensus. And I will never be able to pronounce this word right, and I hate it now after the outcomes of this process. But that was manufactured while civil society was witnessed weeks of backroom negotiations, pressures, and procedures, opacity, etc., etc. The transparency that should define international cooperation was absent. And I maybe if you all remember that there was a campaign led by the FFD civil society mechanism on let the civil society in. I mean, transparency. I mean, we need to be in the negotiations, but we were banned at the last moment of the process, the very important moment of the process. So the the transparency wasn't there. The accountability mechanism that civil society fought for were diluted. Calls for real actions on debt, climate finance, tax justice, and reform of the global financial architecture were also deflected or erased. So what really happened is the global north block and resist every demand that would have shifted power or money towards the global south. The EU and the allies worked behind the scenes to weaken the text on systematic issues, especially in international tax and government, debt restructuring, and climate justice. And we have always to put in mind that tax, debt, and climate are related. This discussion always related together. Um, I mean, what that means for us, but what this week outcomes means for Africa and marginalized communities. This is limited the new finance or and delays crucial adaptation investments. Also, debt financed climate finance risks worsen long-term vulnerability. And most of our countries are already under a huge debt burden and are facing uh, يعني major climate issues and ecological collapse. Um, طبعا pushing inequalities because without gender budgeting, women and marginalized group are sidelined, and also stalled tax debt reforms means no structure fix for revenue uh, mobilization. So I mean, we had great expectations or hope in the process, but the outcomes wasn't for the global south, although the world now is very, very, in a very, our world, I mean, not their world, because what those outcomes means that we are living in two different worlds. Our world is full of extractivism, debt burden, climate challenges, ecological collapse, and war, and the northern world is different. Just being using the same old methodology and claiming that they are saving the multilateral system, which is not true. What is happening now? What happened now is this multilateral system by this outcome actually announce that it is a dead horse to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheeren, especially for highlighting the worsening of vulnerability for women and girls and other marginalized groups. And I know recently the United States also put out another statement where they said that they cannot accept, I think they said, an unnecessary and distracting focus on climate when it comes to issues of poverty and issues of women's vulnerability, which really goes to show that the intersectionality of these issues is not recognized, which is why it's so important that you have also pointed out that a loss on debt justice on the Sovereign Debt Convention is also a loss on tax and it's also a loss on climate. So I know, Sheeren, that you said you will be leaving us a bit earlier, so I don't know if you have time to maybe take a few questions before you leave. I don't know how much more time you have, but if you have to leave very soon, then maybe you can also speak on the issue of what we can do in the meantime ahead of Sevilla and also during the conference. Is there any space for meaningful engagement to influence the process? And if so, what is that? What can we do I guess, to save what's left of this process?
Yes, of course. I can add on this, and please accept my apologies. I have an emergency. Well, there is a lot to be done. I mean, it's not the end. It's not the end. It is. It's. I believe that our fight started in a different way, and we need to do different methodology. We need to guard the climate language to ensure explicit inclusion for of adaptation, loss and damage, etc., etc. Specific climate finance target to set the our volume that the global south really need, and the clear this disbursement timelines. طبعا we need to keep our narrative up, and we need to call for community-led finance governance and accountability tools. But we can, I mean, like, I believe during Sevilla, the presence of a feminist climate finance proposal uh, need to be there. The space of the civil society and the civil society forum, etc., um, is very important because the real discussions will happen there to push for stronger climate and gender mandates in real time. Also, targeted delegation that dissociate, like, uh, press the EU, the UK, the Canadian, the Japanese, etc., to rejoin critical climate language commitment, mobilize coalitions and movements, and I here have to mention the outcomes of the Rabat meeting that us and Akina Mama, Widow, and Kusherid and others were part of it. The demands that is coming out from the Rabat roadmap and our feminist demands around the global economical structure against colonialization, against imperialism, against militarization is a very important discussion that can very important to be handled in Sevilla, and definitely it's not the end of it. We can reshape this or not only reshape, we can reinvent a global economical system that works for us. I mean, it's important also to start to have the discussions around how South-South cooperation will work, and how us as a feminist movement from Africa and from the global South need to lead this initiative, and this is part of the outcomes of the Rabat roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheeren, especially for emphasizing the South-South cooperation, which is extremely important to the work that we do and anything that we do moving forward. I would like to open the floor if anyone has any insights or questions for Sheeren before we move on to the next speaker. You can raise your hand or you can put your question or comment in the chat while we still have Sheeren with us. I'll just give maybe 30 seconds for anyone to raise their hand. Okay, well, anyone who has any questions prepares themselves. I think Sheeren did an extremely good job since we don't have any questions. So in the meantime, I will move on to the next speaker, who is Diana Muchoge with the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDad, who will be taking us through the session on debt. So as we know, the debt paragraph was considerably diluted and stripped of any real power, and now reads in part that we will initiate an intergovernmental process at the UN with a view to making recommendations for closing gaps in the debt architecture. And we know that as we prepare for Sevilla, one of the main calls remains that those who are aggravating the debt crisis should not be the same ones who are leading the reform process. As we speak, our colleagues at AfroDad, who are also co-convening this session with MENAFEM, and others, of course, have convened the Africa International People's Tribunal to hear how austerity measures and debt-driven models continue to impede Africa's development. So I would like to invite Diana to take us through this next session. You're very welcome, Diana. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Akina Mama wa Africa for inviting us for this very important webinar, just to discuss the financing for development negotiations, specifically on the chapter of debt and debt sustainability. And just to pick up from where Sheeren left off, going into the negotiations, civil society organizations, including AfroDad, we were calling for the intergovernmental process at the United Nations in terms of coming up with the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. And this was also being pushed by the Africa Group and the Alliance of Small Island States. We also had Pakistan and Brazil supporting this paragraph. And so this has been the big push getting into the negotiations. And then one of the other issues that was being pushed by civil society and the big asks coming also from member states is the reform of the global financial architecture. And this includes the debt architecture, looking at debt as more of a systemic issue, not looking at it as a solvency or liquidity issue, looking at it more holistically, and then looking at the restructuring process of debt, making sure that all parties are on the table, and this is the creditor and the lender. And then another big thing that also came out from the recently concluded AU conference on debt was the issue of the common framework, which is not working for Africa. The G20 common framework, it has been shown, and there's evidence that it is too lengthy, it is too slow, it leaves out negotiating countries, and they don't have a platform to collectively negotiate. So the key the key points from CSOs in the Global South was calling out the failure of the G20 common framework. And of course, throughout the negotiations, there's been a lot of talk on debt swaps, but CSOs are calling out debt swaps not as solutions to the debt crisis. They are inadequate to address debt vulnerabilities and don't provide sufficient resources to tackle liquidity constraints. And then one other key thing in the negotiation has been calling out credit rating agencies and how they've been downgrading our countries, and calling for the reform of credit rating agencies. And this is also tied to the reform of the financing architecture, ensuring that there's an intergovernmental commission to regulate, monitor, and hold credit rating agencies accountable, given the central role that they play in the international financial architecture. So just from what you've mentioned, and also from what Sheeren said, the process of negotiation and participation of civil society organizations in the negotiation was not without challenges. There was a challenge of transparency, which you have mentioned in your interventions, and Sheeren has also pointed out to this: lack of transparency, a lot of opaque processes, secretive processes, not being involved in some of the programs, being left out of crucial negotiation processes. So the space for civil society participation was actually shrinking. There was a lot of procedural issues, last-minute changes to the program, of which, of course, civil society was not aware. And then the outcome document was designed, the way it was designed and the spirit in which it was negotiated was also done in a way that civil society organizations were sort of locked out, and they were not given the opportunity to engage. And then so those would be the major negotiation challenges, including what has been mentioned on the blockers. Bad faith in terms of negotiations in the part of the global north. We do have the European Union, United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, that have dissociated themselves from the paragraph on the intergovernmental process, on having the UN Framework Convention on Debt. And this came just recently in the adoption of the outcome document. They have thrown disarray into the negotiations towards a comprehensive debt reform package ahead of FFD. And then also we have other wealthy countries that are blocking critical debt reforms and have ignored the Africa Union Commission call for the establishment of a UN Framework Convention on Debt. And then something else just to add is that there is hope, because we do have, at least in this outcome document, the intergovernmental process that has been included in the outcome document. It's an ask that has been there, and we feel it's something we can use moving forward. It's an opportunity to continue pushing and advocating for it. And just to highlight why it's important, especially for countries, it's because it has several dynamics to it. It does have rules and principles of binding lending and borrowing, which is very important. It includes multilateral sovereign debt resolution mechanism. It also has fair debt restructuring principles and debt cancellation, which has been mentioned. And then automatic mechanism for debt payment suspension. And then risk sharing clauses are also included. There's also within the UN framework a global debt transparency registry, independent debt sustainability framework and analysis. And then within it, there's also domestic reforms, which talks about domestic legislation on debt and management, including responsible borrowing and lending. It also includes debt audits within the domestic reforms at the national level, and then domestic legislation on creditor countries on effective debt resolution, and asset management, industry regulation, regulation and supervision of credit rating agencies, and capital account management. So you can see why having this UN framework on debt is going to be very important moving on as we continue to advocate for it. Just to finalize on the last point in terms of a weak outcome document, and I think Sheeren has shared it. What would a weak outcome document mean for African countries? We do know that this will have increased vulnerabilities, especially for communities, for women and girls, because we do know that countries are spending more servicing their debt as opposed to servicing social spending. And therefore, we have countries that are spending 25 times more servicing their debt over health and education. And UNCTAD also in their recent report pointed out that 3.3 million people are living in countries where debt servicing actually over exceeds the spending of social services. So this of course will impact on the people, on the citizen, when they're not able to access services because debt has been prioritized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, especially for the emphasis on how social progress is being sacrificed to meet debt obligations. I know you have referenced several reports, including UNCTAD, but there's also another World Bank report from 2021, which showed that public external debt service payments by developing countries exceeded 372 billion US dollars in 2020. And then between 2010 and 2021, we saw developing country debt payments also increase by 120%, which was the highest level that had ever been reached since 2001. And so, like you mentioned, across all developing countries, debt service now consumes approximately 25% of total government spending. And you have also talked about how this is also deepening inequalities for women and girls, because they also tend to rely more on public services. So thank you so much for giving us those updates on where we are at on the thematic issue of debt. So while I still have you, maybe you can also give us, you can also let us know what are the feminist demands and priorities that we should be pushing for ahead of Sevilla and also while we are at the conference.
Thank you for that. So in terms of the feminist calls, is to ensure that the process remains transparent, accountable, equitable, and people-centered, urging governments to support the UN Convention on International Tax Cooperation, to curb corporate capture of states, advance global governance, and promote progressive tax systems, and then championing the UN Sovereign Debt Convention framework to cancel and restructure crippling debts that drain resources from right-based services. And then FFD4 must mandate gender transformative budgeting that redistributes and rewards unpaid and underpaid care work, ensuring public investment in quality care policies and systems, and then ensuring that health, education, and social protection are actually met by countries, and universal access for all. Over to you.
Sorry, Dan, I was having issues with my network, but thank you very much for those. I know something that you also emphasized, as well as Sheeren, is that there's a lot of hope still, although we recognize that the document is significantly less ambitious than the zero draft and the documents following after that, until the one that we have today. But also, after sharing with us the feminist priorities and demands, are there any opportunities moving forward for us to influence the process or to engage meaningfully in it? I know we have the feminist forum that will be taking place at Sevilla, as well as the global days of action and the protest, the demonstrations that will be taking place. But are there any other opportunities for us to engage, especially for those who will not be able to take part in the conference physically? If you could also speak on that.
Yes, there are opportunities to engage, and I think Sheeren pointed out to that. We still have a lot of work to do to ensure that commitments are met, and so there's a lot of organizing that's going on in the different civil society groupings, and there is a feminist working group under the CSO Financing for Development mechanism. I believe they're making a lot of progress in terms of planning for the future and also how to engage, especially your country, in terms of what comes out from Seville. it's important that we keep track of how our countries are taking action or taking some of the pointers coming out from Seville, but also at the same time, in terms of having collaborative advocacy events afterwards with key priorities and key targets. And I think Sheeren mentioned this in terms of the process moving forward and exactly knowing what we want to get out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. I would like now to open the floor for anyone who may have any insights, any comments, or any questions for the speakers before we close this session. Yeah. I see Sarah has her hand raised. Over, you can unmute and speak.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and this conversation has been very enlightening. I would want to know the relationship between debt and economic gendered economic justice, and how we can be able to fight the two concurrently as in the feminist movement.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We've taken note of your question. Is there anyone else who would like to speak before Diana comes in? Yes, Faith, over to you.
Thank you, and apologies if there's any background noise, but thanks, Diana, and thanks, Patricia. I have a question around the aspect of debt to GDP. I wanted to find out from Diana if there's been any specific conversations around this particular issue, considering that there's been a lot of research that has been done around questioning its validity, but also there's been questions around it based on the idea of rethinking GDP. So I wanted to find out if there's been any specific conversations within the process as also part of the broader work of reforming the data architecture. Thanks.
We have a comment in the chat, which I'll just read out loud from Aurora. In addition to relying on CSO mechanisms, comms resources, we can also pull together our social media resources across feminist organizations represented by this community plugged into FFD4 to make bigger noise and have greater reach. This will need some active coordination with CSO mechanism comms teams ahead and during the conference. Thank you very much, Aurora, for that point. For those who may not be aware, the CSO FFD mechanism also put out a social media comms kit for those who would like to, as Aurora said, make more noise and have greater reach during this process. So I'll just search for that shortly and put it in the chat. But yeah, there are already some key asks that we are chasing for the FFD4. And yeah, there are several organizations that are doing this work. So thank you very much for pointing that out. But if anyone else has any more resources that we can rely on as we continue to push for both debt and climate justice in the FFD4 agenda, please feel free to add those to the chat. And yeah, I will pass it on to Diana to answer some of the questions, but I will come in as well to speak. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you. I didn't get the first question well. If she could kindly repeat. The question on debt and gender.
Okay, I think she asked for more insight into how debt justice and gender are linked together, so that someone that is pushing for one is also pushing for the other, because they get the intersectionality between the two issues. So yeah, that was the first question. Unless I was wrong, then Sarah can correct me or someone else.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'll start with the second one that was posed on debt to GDP. I mentioned earlier that the call and what has been going on in the negotiation is for the reform of the financial architecture, and that in itself includes the issue of debt being looked at, debt and GDP being put together. And as you've rightly said, there's a lot of research that points out to this not working. So in the arguments for the reform, there's been a lot of, I would say, inputs from member states, especially in Africa and in the global south, talking about how the financing architecture as it is not working. And one of the reasons it's not working is because of some of these systems that have been in place, which continue to perpetuate inequality and poverty. And I would add that this debt to GDP is one of them. So the reform of the financial architecture incorporates this argument, plus many other arguments, including some of the solutions that the IMF continues to give, which are not working for global South countries. Debt and gender are actually very much interlinked. And in the last intervention, or the second last intervention I made, we always talk about what debt or how debt impacts on the people. And one of the ways is through austerity measures, which are conditions that are imposed by IMF policies. And with austerity, what usually happens is governments will be forced to cut their budgets, specifically on health and education. And the people who bear the brunt of this are women and girls. And I'm sure most of us have been able to witness in the past few days a lot of outcry from people in terms of not being able to access services. When you go to a hospital, you find there are no machines. We have doctors who are striking. In the education sector, we've seen teachers not being enough, especially with the student enrollment. We've had a lot of issues with infrastructure, lack of books, lack of desks, lack of schools. So this is just a very tangible example in terms of what it means when a government is forced to service debt, because it means there's no room, there's no fiscal space for the government to be able to mobilize enough revenue to fund its social services. So it's actually very linked. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Diana. I hope those questions have been answered, but also just to add on how debt impacts women and girls, like Diana mentioned, when countries are spending large portions of their budgets on repaying debt, they have to cut back on public services, and usually the first ones to be cut are healthcare, we have education, and then social protection sectors, which we know disproportionately affect women and other marginalized groups. The easiest example is the COVID pandemic, and where funding for health was cut in spite of the fact that it was extremely necessary at that point to actually increase that budget. And because of that, we saw women and girls left with more unpaid care responsibility and fewer resources to rely on. We also see, like Diana spoke about, we see women bearing the burden of austerity measures, which are pushed by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So we have, for example, wage freezes, we have cuts in food and fuel subsidies, we have privatization of services, and also their commercialization, which again impacts women and girls because they are disproportionately, sorry, they are overrepresented in poverty. So they have less protections when the economy is squeezed, basically. We also have debt deepening gender inequalities because the countries do not have the policy space to invest in gender transformative policies such as universal childcare, fairer wages and legal protections for informal workers. So in summary, really debt becomes a tool of structural inequalities and really impacts those who are already structurally marginalized. So I don't know if we have any more questions or comments for the speaker or anyone else who would like to speak. We have put some resources in the chat, including the social media pack, which was asked about, for those who would like to continue pushing these messages, because like both Sheeren and Diana spoke about, hope, not all hope is lost yet. So we still have time to call out these institutions and also to call upon our member states, the co-facilitators and the co-chairs to do the right thing at Sevilla, where we'll be waiting for the Sevilla commitment to be formally adopted at the 4th International Conference for Financing for Development. So if we do not have any more questions or comments, I would like to thank the speakers, both Diana Muchoge and Sheeren Talaat in her absence, as well as our co-conveners, Afrodad and Menafem, for taking the time to be here with us today and also investing in this conversation, and also to thank all the participants who made the time to attend. I hope this session has been extremely useful for all those who would like to follow this process, and also those who will be in Sevilla next week. Otherwise, thank you everyone. And yeah, I would like to bring the session to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.